In 1955, the average American television set broke down once every 2 years. Not because the people who owned them were careless, not because the sets were cheaply made, although some of them were, because a television set of the 1950s contained between 12 and 30 vacuum tubes, each one a fragile glass cylinder filled with heated metal and wire, each one performing a specific function in the process of converting the invisible radio signal coming through the antenna on the roof into the moving image on the screen. And vacuum tubes failed. Regularly, predictably, inevitably. When a tube failed, the set went dark, or the picture rolled, or the sound disappeared, or the image collapsed into a bright horizontal line across the middle of the screen. The family gathered in the living room to watch their program found themselves instead staring at a box that had stopped working. In an era when the television was the most expensive single object in most American households, and when the program it had stopped showing was one they had been looking forward to all week. This is the moment that built an industry. Within walking distance of virtually every American neighborhood in the 1950s, there was a man who could fix this problem. He worked in a shop that might have been a storefront on the commercial strip, or a converted garage, or a back room behind a radio sales counter, and his shop smelled of hot solder and electronic components, and the specific warm smell of vacuum tubes running at temperature. He had a tube tester on his counter, a wall of replacement tubes in their labeled bins, and the accumulated knowledge of thousands of television sets opened and diagnosed and repaired. He was the television repairman, and in the 1950s and 1960s, he was as necessary to American neighborhood life as the pharmacist or the plumber. At the peak of the television repair industry in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there were approximately 100,000 television repair shops operating in the United States. 100,000. In a country with approximately 60 million television sets in operation, this meant that there was roughly one repair shop for every 600 television sets, a density of specialized service that has no contemporary equivalent in any consumer electronics category. This video is the story of that industry, why it existed, how it worked, who built it, what it meant to the communities it served, and what happened to make 100,000 skilled technicians and their shops disappear from the American landscape within a generation, leaving behind nothing but the warm memory of a man with a soldering iron who could make the television work again. The television set and why it was always breaking. To understand why the television repair industry existed at the scale it did, you need to understand what a 1950s television set actually was, because it was a genuinely complicated piece of machinery whose complexity was the source of its fragility. The television set of the early 1950s was the most sophisticated consumer electronic device that had ever been mass-produced and sold to the general public. It received a radio frequency signal through its antenna, processed that signal through a series of electronic stages to extract the audio and video information it contained, generated the electron beam that scanned across the face of the picture tube 60 times per second to build the image from the signal, amplified the audio signal for the speaker, and managed the synchronization of all these processes so that the picture and sound arrived at the viewer simultaneously and in correct relationship to each other. Each of these functions required its own electronic circuits, and each of those circuits depended on the correct operation of the vacuum tubes that were its active components. A typical 1950s black and white television set contained between 17 and 24 vacuum tubes, with some of the more complex sets containing 30 or more. Each tube was a sealed glass envelope containing a vacuum, a heated cathode that emitted electrons, and various metal structures that controlled the flow of those electrons to perform the amplification or switching function the circuit required. The heated cathode was the source of the tube's vulnerability. To emit electrons, the cathode had to be heated to a specific temperature by a small filament, similar in principle to the filament in a light bulb, and that filament was subject to the same failure mode as a light bulb filament. It could burn out. When a tube's filament burned out, the tube went cold, stopped emitting electrons, and ceased to perform its function. The circuit that depended on it failed. The failure of one circuit typically caused cascading failures in dependent circuits, and the result was a television set that did not work. The other primary failure mode was the gradual deterioration of the tube's emission capability. As the cathode material that emitted electrons was consumed by the heating process over thousands of hours of operation, the tube's emission decreased. A tube that had started its life emitting electrons at a specific rate might, after 2,000 hours of operation, emit them at only 70% of the original rate. The television's performance degraded gradually as its tubes weakened, the picture becoming dimmer or less stable, or the sound becoming thinner, until the set was noticeably inferior to what it had been when new. This degradation was insidious precisely because it was gradual. The family that had watched their television set every evening for 3 years had adapted to its current performance without being aware that they were adapting, because the change had been so slow that no single evening showed a noticeable difference from the one before. They had forgotten what the set had looked like when it was new, and the repairman who serviced the set sometimes found that replacing the weakened tubes produced a reaction of genuine surprise from the family, who had not realized how much they had lost until they saw what the restored set looked like. The repair shop and what happened inside it. The television repair shop of the 1950s was a working environment whose specific character was determined by the nature of the work performed in it, and that character was unlike any other retail environment in the neighborhood. The first thing you noticed when you walked into a television repair shop was the smell. Hot solder has a specific smell, a slightly acrid, slightly metallic odor that is produced by the rosin flux burning off as the iron contacts the joint. And this smell was the constant background of any shop in active operation. Mixed with it was the warm smell of the repair shop's own equipment running. The tube tester on the counter with its own tubes heating up. The oscilloscope on the workbench, whose electron beam was painting its green trace across the face of the tube. The bench power supplies warming the circuits of whatever set was under examination. The walls of the repair shop were typically lined with shelves holding tubes in their cardboard boxes, organized by type number. The RCA tube numbering system that organized the American tube industry used a combination of numbers and letters to indicate each tube's specific electrical characteristics, and a shop that could service all the television sets it might receive needed to stock hundreds of different tube types. The wall of tubes was the shop's primary inventory, and a skilled technician knew at a glance which shelf held the tube he needed and which sets used it. The workbench where the actual repair was performed was a deliberate environment. The television set under repair was positioned so that the technician could access its chassis while it was energized, which required specific safety habits because the voltages present inside a 1950s television set were genuinely dangerous. The picture tube in a typical set operated at voltages between 8 and 25,000 volts, generated by a high-voltage power supply that could deliver a lethal shock to a technician who made contact with it through the wrong approach to the chassis. The experienced repair technician worked with a specific set of habits that kept him safe while allowing him to diagnose and repair the energized set. One hand in his pocket or behind his back when probing high-voltage circuits, so that any accidental contact was between the probe and his single working hand rather than across his chest. Discharge of the picture tube's high-voltage storage before touching the chassis. Specific probe and test lead practices that minimize the risk of accidental contact. These were not written rules, but embodied habits, acquired in training and reinforced by years of working on equipment that could kill you if you forgot what you were doing. The tube tester, the most important machine in the shop. The tube tester was the primary diagnostic tool of the television repair industry, and its presence defined the repair shop in the same way that the stethoscope defines the medical examination. You could not run a television repair shop in the 1950s without a tube tester, and the quality and capability of the tester was one of the primary determinants of the shop's diagnostic capability. A tube tester measured the emission of a tube's cathode and compared it to the specification for that tube type, indicating on a meter whether the tube was good, weak, or bad. The standard tester used by most repair shops, made by companies including Hickok, B&K, and Sylvania, could test several hundred tube types by selecting the correct socket connection and bias voltage settings for each type, and reading the resulting emission on a calibrated meter. The tube tester was also available to the general public at many drugstores, hardware stores, and variety stores in a specific accommodation to the era's do-it-yourself repair culture. A family whose television had gone dark could, if the problem was a simple tube failure, potentially diagnose and fix it themselves by removing the tubes one by one, carrying them to the nearest tube tester at the Walgreens or the hardware store, testing each one, purchasing replacements for those that failed the test, and reinstalling them. This self-service diagnostic capability was supported by the tube manufacturers, who published advertisements and promotional materials encouraging homeowners to maintain their television sets by testing the tubes regularly. The public tube tester at the drugstore was one of the specific objects that connected the television repair culture to the broader neighborhood life, and the Saturday afternoon ritual of a family bringing a bag of tubes to the Rexall drugstore to test them was common enough in the 1950s to be a recognizable feature of the era's domestic life. It also created an introduction to the television repair industry for many people who would go on to become repair technicians, because the boy who watched the tube tester's needle and learned which tubes failed and why was the boy who might eventually take an interest in what the tubes were doing and how the circuits they populated worked. The technician, who he was and how he learned. The television repair technician of the 1950s was a specific kind of skilled worker whose knowledge base combined theoretical understanding of electronics with practical experience diagnosing and repairing specific equipment, and whose training came through a variety of channels that reflected the variety of paths into the trade. The most common path into television repair in the early 1950s was through radio repair, which had been a skilled trade since the 1920s, and which shared the fundamental knowledge base of vacuum tube electronics that television repair required. A radio repair technician, who had spent the 1940s keeping his neighborhood's radios operational, had the electronic fundamentals that television repair required. And many of the men who opened television repair shops in the late 1940s and early 1950s were radio repairers who expanded into the new medium as it became dominant. The military had been another major training ground for the electronic skills that television repair required. The veterans of World War II who had served in communications, radar, sonar, or aviation electronics had received intensive technical training in the maintenance of complex electronic equipment under field conditions. A man who had kept a radar set operational on a destroyer or maintained the communications equipment of an infantry division had the fundamental electronics knowledge that television repair required, and many of these men entered the civilian electronics service industry after the war. The vocational training programs that expanded in the post-war decade also fed the television repair industry. Trade schools and correspondence courses in electronics were numerous and heavily advertised in the popular press of the era, promising students the skills to enter a rapidly growing field that needed trained technicians in every community in the country. The National Radio Institute, the DeVry Institute, and various regional trade schools produced graduates specifically trained for the radio and television service industry. The manufacturer training programs offered by RCA, Zenith, Admiral, and the other major television manufacturers were another important training channel, particularly for technicians who wanted to work on specific brands. RCA's Institutes of Technology offered courses in television servicing that certified technicians in the specific equipment the company produced, and completion of these courses was a credential that many shops advertised to their customers as evidence of their technical capability. The economics of repair in the 1950s. The economics of the television repair industry in the 1950s were shaped by a specific relationship between the cost of a television set and the cost of repairing it that strongly favored repair over replacement in virtually every failure scenario. A new black and white television set in 1955 cost between $200 and $500, depending on the screen size and the manufacturer, in an era when the median American household income was approximately $4,000 per year. A new television thus represented between 5 and 12% of annual household income, which made it a major purchase requiring planning and saving, rather than an impulsive expenditure that could be replaced without significant financial consequence. A typical repair, replacing a failed tube or a faulty component, cost between $5 and $30 in parts and labor. Even a major repair, requiring the replacement of the picture tube, which was the most expensive single component in the set, typically cost less than $100 and was therefore dramatically cheaper than purchasing a new set. The economics of repair were compelling at every failure scenario, and the decision to repair rather than replace was not a difficult one for most families in most circumstances. The labor cost of the repair was also shaped by the specific economics of the trade. A television repair technician in the 1950s was a skilled craftsman whose wage reflected the genuine skill his work required, but whose labor cost was competitive with the alternative of replacement in a way that it would not be in subsequent decades, when the real cost of manufactured goods declined dramatically relative to the real cost of skilled labor. The shop that charged $3 per hour for bench labor in 1955 was providing skilled diagnostic and repair work at a price that was affordable relative to the cost of the television it was repairing, and the technician who could diagnose a complex problem and repair it in 2 hours was providing work worth its cost many times over when measured against the alternative of spending $200 on a new set. The house call. When the repairman came to you. One of the most distinctive features of the television repair industry in the 1950s was the house call, the service visit in which the repair technician came to the customer's home with his equipment to diagnose and, if possible, repair the television set without moving it. The house call was a genuine service necessity in an era before the miniaturization of electronics made television sets lighter and more portable. A 1950s console television, the large cabinet model that stood on the floor and served as a piece of furniture as well as an entertainment device, could weigh over 100 pounds and was not something a family could easily transport to a repair shop. The repairman who came to the house with his tube tester, his oscilloscope, and his box of common replacement tubes was providing a service whose convenience was directly proportional to the inconvenience of the alternative. The house call was also a social event in the specific way that service visits to the home were social events in the 1950s. The repairman who arrived at the door was invited in, shown to the television set, offered coffee or tea while he worked, and engaged in conversation during the diagnosis and repair process. He was a professional visitor whose work was performed in the family's living space, and whose presence in that space created a social interaction that was warmer and more personal than any transaction conducted in a commercial setting. Many television repairmen developed the same relationship with their regular customers that the family doctor or the family pharmacist had developed over years of repeated service contact. They knew which sets each family owned, what problems those sets had had before, how the family used the television, and what programming they watched. And they carried this accumulated knowledge into each service call in a way that made the interaction more efficient and more personal than a cold service call to a stranger. The house call was charged at a rate that included the travel time as well as the bench time, and the standard practice of the era was to charge a flat service call fee, plus parts, and any additional labor beyond the initial diagnosis. A service call that resulted in a simple tube replacement might cost between $3 and $8 total. A call that required the technician to bring the set back to the shop for further work would add the cost of the bench repair to the initial service call charge. What the repair shop meant to the neighborhood. The television repair shop of the 1950s was not only a commercial service establishment. It was a community institution in the specific sense that it served a function that connected it to the daily life of its neighborhood in ways that went beyond the transactions it conducted. The repair shop was where people went when the most important electronic appliance in their home had failed, which meant it was where they went when something had gone wrong with the center of their family's leisure life. The television of the 1950s was not an accessory. It was the primary source of evening entertainment for the family, the device around which the evening routine was organized, the mechanism through which the family experienced the news and the variety shows and the dramas and the sporting events that constituted the shared cultural life of the decade. When it failed, something essential had failed, and the repairman who fixed it had restored something essential. This emotional weight gave the television repair shop a significance in the neighborhood that exceeded its commercial function. The man who fixed the television was the man who made everything normal again, who restored the family's routine and the family's connection to the broader entertainment culture. He was thanked not in the measured way of a satisfied customer, but with the specific gratitude of a person who has had something important returned to them. The community bulletin board that many repair shops maintained, the small display in the front window or on the counter that carried neighborhood announcements and local news, was another expression of the shop's community function. The repair shop was a destination that many neighborhood residents visited regularly, either as customers or as people who walked past or stopped in for conversation. And the shop's position in the neighborhood's daily circulation made it a natural location for community communication. The shop owner, who had been in the same location for 10 or 15 years, knew his neighborhood in the specific and accumulated way of someone who had served it daily through births and deaths and children growing up and families moving in and moving out. He was a fixed point in the neighborhood's changing landscape, present at a specific address, doing a specific job, and the continuity of his presence gave him a relationship with the neighborhood's life that the transient commercial establishments that came and went around him could not match. The technology of the repair, what the technician actually did. Understanding what the television repair technician actually did to diagnose and repair a failed set is essential to appreciating both the skill the work required and the reason that skill eventually became unnecessary. The diagnostic process for a failed television set began with observation. What was the set doing or failing to do? A set with no picture and no sound had probably lost power or had a failure in the primary power supply. A set with sound but no picture had probably lost its high voltage, which was required to energize the picture tube. A set with a rolling or unstable picture had probably lost synchronization, which was the circuit that kept the scanning electron beam locked to the broadcast signal. Each symptom pointed to a specific area of the set's circuitry, and the experienced technician's first step was to translate the symptom into a diagnostic hypothesis. The tube tester was the first tool applied to most diagnoses, because tube failure was the most common cause of television malfunction and the easiest to test for. The technician would test the tubes in the section of the set suggested by the symptom, replacing any that tested weak or bad. In many cases, this was sufficient. A failed tube replaced, the set working again. When tube testing did not identify the problem, the technician moved to the next level of diagnosis, using his oscilloscope and voltmeter to measure the actual signals and voltages in the set circuits and compare them to the specifications published in the manufacturer's service manual. A signal that was present but distorted indicated a problem in the circuit that was supposed to process it. A voltage that was outside specification indicated a problem in the power supply or in the circuit component that was supposed to produce it. This level of diagnosis required genuine understanding of how the circuits worked, not just the ability to read a meter, but the ability to interpret what the meter was reading in the context of the circuit's function and to identify which component, out of the dozens present in a typical circuit, was responsible for the deviation. This was the skill that separated the genuinely capable technician from the parts swapper, the technician who could only diagnose by replacing components one at a time until the problem disappeared. The repair itself once the problem was identified, was typically the desoldering of the failed component and the installation of a replacement. The soldering iron work required the specific skills of controlled heat application and solder flow management that produce reliable electrical connections without damaging adjacent components. And the technician who had done thousands of solder joints had developed these skills to the point of reliable, automatic competence. The service manual and the industry it supported. Every television set produced by every major manufacturer was accompanied by a service manual, published by the manufacturer and sold to service technicians, that contained the complete schematic diagram of the set circuits, the specified operating voltages and signal levels at every test point in the circuit, the alignment procedures for the tuner and the IF amplifier stages, and the parts list with manufacturer part numbers for every component in the set. The service manual was the foundation document of the television repair industry. Without it, the diagnosis of any problem beyond a failed tube was extremely difficult, because the specific circuit designs of different sets differed enough that the technician who was familiar with RCA sets might be at a disadvantage when confronted with an Admiral or a Zenith without the service data for that specific model. The manual provided the map that made the diagnosis systematic rather than random. The publishing and distribution of service manuals was a significant industry in itself. Howard Sams and Company, based in Indianapolis, Indiana, became the primary publisher of standardized service documentation for the consumer electronics industry, publishing its PhotoFact service guides that provided the schematic and service data for virtually every consumer radio and television set produced in the United States. The PhotoFact binders, organized by manufacturer and model, were standard equipment in every professional television repair shop, and the subscription service that delivered new binders as new sets were introduced was a recurring expense that the professional shop budgeted for as a cost of staying current in a rapidly changing product landscape. The parts distribution system that supported the television repair industry was equally extensive. Every major television manufacturer maintained a network of authorized parts distributors who stocked the replacement components and tubes needed to service their sets. Independent parts distributors carried components from multiple manufacturers, providing the local repair shop with access to the parts it needed without requiring separate orders from multiple sources. The local parts house, which a repair technician could call in the morning and have a part delivered by afternoon, or could visit in person to pick up a needed component immediately, was as essential to the industry's function as the technicians themselves. The color television revolution and its complications. The introduction of compatible color television in the early 1950s and its gradual adoption through the decade and into the 1960s added a new dimension of complexity to the television repair industry that both increased the demand for skilled technicians and raised the skill level required to serve the color television market. A color television set of the late 1950s or early 1960s contained approximately twice as many tubes as a comparable black and white set, adding color demodulation circuits, color picture tube drive circuits, the color killer, and burst separator circuits that manage the transition between color and black and white portions of the broadcast, and the complex color picture tube itself, with its 3 electron guns and its shadow mask. The RCACT 100, one of the first mass-produced color television sets sold in the United States in 1954, contained approximately 40 vacuum tubes and presented a diagnostic challenge that was substantially more complex than any black and white set. Color television also required a periodic adjustment procedure called convergence alignment, in which the 3 electron beams of the color picture tube were adjusted to coincide precisely at every point on the screen. A color television set whose convergence was off would show colored fringes around the edges of objects on the screen, with the red, green, and blue components of the image failing to align correctly. The convergence adjustment required a specific test pattern and a specific set of adjustments at multiple controls on the convergence board, and achieving correct convergence on a complex set could take an experienced technician several hours. The color television repair market was therefore a market for genuinely skilled technicians, and the shops that were capable of servicing color sets commanded premium labor rates that reflected the additional skill their work required. The technician who had invested the time to learn color television servicing occupied a more specialized position in the market than the technician who serviced only black and white sets, and the premium he could charge reflected the scarcity of that specialization. The European approach. What other countries did? The television repair culture that existed in the United States in the 1950s had counterparts in the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and other countries that adopted television broadcasting in the post-war period. And the comparison between the American approach and the European one reveals both the similarities of the technical challenges and the differences in the social and economic contexts in which they were addressed. In the United Kingdom, the BBC had been broadcasting television since 1936, and the post-war resumption of broadcasting in 1946 created a market for television sets that developed somewhat earlier than the American market, and that produced a repair industry organized along similar lines. The British television repair technician, whose work was organized around the same vacuum tube technology as his American counterpart, served a market that was organized differently in one significant respect: the British television rental market. Television rental, in which families paid a weekly fee to rent rather than purchase their television set, was a major component of the British television market in the 1950s and 1960s, and the rental companies maintained their own service organizations to repair the sets they rented. The Rent-A-Set and radio rentals companies that dominated the British rental market employed their own technicians who serviced the rented sets under the terms of the rental agreement that included maintenance and repair. This organizational model concentrated the repair function within large companies rather than distributing it through independent neighborhood shops, producing a different social texture to the British repair industry than the American one had. In Germany, the post-war development of the television market occurred somewhat later than in the United States or the United Kingdom, with mass television adoption occurring in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The German television repair industry reflected the broader German craft tradition, in which the Rundfunk- und Fernsehtechniker, the radio and television technician, was a recognized trade with a formal apprenticeship structure and a certification examination administered by the relevant trade guild. The German approach to television repair was therefore more formally structured than the American one, with the technician's qualification documented in a way that the American trade did not require. The beginning of the end. Transistors and the changing economics. The transistor, invented at Bell Laboratories in 1947 and gradually introduced into consumer electronics through the 1950s, represented the technology that would eventually make the vacuum tube obsolete, and with it, the repair industry that tube failure had sustained. The first transistorized consumer products were portable radios, which appeared in the mid-1950s, and which used transistors in place of the small tubes that portable radios had previously required. The transistor had several advantages over the vacuum tube that were immediately apparent to manufacturers. It was smaller, required no heated filament and therefore no warm-up time, and no filament power consumption, operated at lower voltages, and was dramatically more reliable than the tubes it replaced. A transistor did not have a cathode to burn out. It had no moving parts. Its failure rate was orders of magnitude lower than that of a comparable vacuum tube. The introduction of transistors into television sets was slower than their introduction into radios, because the high voltage requirements of the television's picture tube and its associated circuits were more difficult to serve with the transistors available in the late 1950s. Transistorized televisions began appearing in the early 1960s, and by the mid-1960s, the hybrid set, containing both tubes in its high-voltage circuits and transistors in its lower voltage signal processing circuits had become common. The fully solid-state television, containing no vacuum tubes, arrived in the late 1960s and early 1970s and represented the moment when the economics of the repair industry began to shift fundamentally. A television set without vacuum tubes did not fail at the rate that a tube set failed, because the primary mechanism of tube set failure, the burned-out cathode and the weakened emission, no longer existed in a transistorized set. The service call rate for solid-state television sets was a fraction of the service call rate for comparable tube sets. The final blow. The disposable economy arrives. The technological change represented by the solid-state television was the necessary precondition for the transformation of the consumer electronics market that completed the destruction of the television repair industry. But the transformation itself was an economic and cultural change as much as a technological one. The integrated circuit, which placed the functions of dozens of transistors on a single chip of silicon, and the large-scale integration that followed through the 1970s and 1980s, reduced the manufacturing cost of consumer electronics to the point where the economic calculation that had always favored repair over replacement was reversed. A television set in 1955 was expensive because the components it contained were individually expensive, and the labor to assemble them was substantial. A television set in 1980 was cheaper in real terms than its 1955 equivalent because the integrated circuits it contained were manufactured in quantities that reduced their unit cost to a fraction of what individual components had cost, and because the automated assembly processes that built them required less labor than the hand assembly of tube-era equipment. When the real cost of a television set fell to the point where a new set cost less than the labor to diagnose and repair a complex failure in an old one, the economic logic of repair ceased to operate. A family in 1975, whose television had a failed integrated circuit, could face a repair bill of $50 in labor alone to diagnose the problem, plus the cost of the replacement circuit, against the option of purchasing a new set for $200 that came with a warranty. The calculation that in 1955 had always favored repair now frequently favored replacement. The shift in manufacturing geography that occurred through the 1970s and 1980s accelerated this trend. Japanese manufacturers, and later Korean and Taiwanese manufacturers, produced consumer electronics at costs that American and European manufacturers could not match, driving down the retail price of television sets and other consumer electronics products in ways that further eroded the economic case for repair. The 100,000 television repair shops of the late 1950s had declined to approximately 20,000 by 1980, and by 2000, the independent television repair shop had become a rarity in most American communities. The industry that had employed 100,000 skilled technicians and served as the neighborhood institution for the repair of the era's most essential home appliance had been effectively eliminated by a combination of improved reliability, reduced manufacturing cost, and the cultural shift toward disposability that accompanied the decline of both. What was lost when the repair shops closed? The disappearance of the television repair shop from the American neighborhood landscape was not only the loss of a commercial service, it was the loss of a specific kind of skilled work and a specific kind of skilled worker that the neighborhood had depended on and that the neighborhood's social life had incorporated. The television repair technician was a person who could look at a complex machine that had failed, understand why it had failed, and restore it to working condition through the application of specific knowledge and specific skill. This is a capability that has value independent of any particular technology, and the disappearance of the trade that had sustained it left the American landscape with fewer people who possessed it. The repair culture more generally, the cultural expectation that broken things would be fixed rather than replaced, that skilled repair was a legitimate and valued occupation, that the person who could restore function to a failed machine was performing work worthy of respect and compensation, was weakened by the same forces that eliminated the television repair industry specifically. The broader repair culture that had sustained not only television repair, but appliance repair and shoe repair and clothing repair and a dozen other trades based on the restoration of broken things to working condition, gave way to a disposability culture in which broken meant replace, and in which the skilled repairer became an increasingly rare and increasingly marginal figure. The environmental consequences of this cultural shift, while not visible in the 1960s and 1970s when the shift was occurring, are clearly visible today in the volumes of electronic waste that the disposability culture produces. The television that was repaired in 1958 and remained in service for 10 years was one television. The television that is replaced every 3 to 5 years because repair is not economic is multiple televisions, each of which must be manufactured and eventually disposed of, at an environmental cost that the repair culture had embedded no equivalent of. The European countries that have maintained stronger repair cultures, partly through policy measures that internalize the environmental cost of disposal, and partly through cultural traditions that value repair as a legitimate and skilled activity, produce less electronic waste per capita than the United States, and maintain larger repair industries in proportion to their populations. Germany's Reparatur Café movement, in which community repair workshops offer volunteer repair services for household electronics and appliances, represents a deliberate attempt to recover something of the repair culture that the consumer electronics industry's economic model had eliminated: the memory of the man with the soldering iron. The television repairman of the 1950s and 1960s is one of the figures that people who grew up in that era remember with a specific and warm clarity. And the specific quality of that memory tells us something about what the repair shop represented in the neighborhood's social life. He was someone who could fix something important. He was someone who came to your house when something essential had broken and made it work again. He was someone who knew your television set and remembered what problems it had had before, who treated the equipment he serviced with the specific respect that a craftsman brings to the objects of his craft, and who communicated that respect to the family who owned the set by treating the repair as serious work worthy of serious skill. The boy who watched the television repairman work, who was allowed to hold the flashlight while the chassis was examined, and to hand tools when they were needed, and to watch the oscilloscope trace while the technician probed the circuit, was a boy who was being shown something important, that the machines around him were not magic, that they operated on principles that could be understood, that understanding those principles was a form of power that enabled you to fix things rather than being helpless before them. Many of the engineers and technicians of the subsequent generation of American electronics, the people who designed and built the integrated circuits and the computers, and the communication systems that transformed the world from the 1970s onward, report early experiences with electronics repair as formative influences on their technical interests and their sense of what was possible for a person who understood how electronic circuits worked. The television repairman, who let a curious child watch him work, was, without knowing it, transmitting something that went well beyond the specific knowledge of how to fix a particular television set. That transmission has been interrupted. The neighborhood television repair shop that might have offered the next generation of electronics engineers their first glimpse of an oscilloscope trace and their first understanding that the television set was not a box of magic, but a collection of components doing specific, understandable things, is gone from most American neighborhoods. The interruption is part of the larger story of what the disappearance of the repair trade meant for the communities it had served. 100,000 shops, 100,000 men with tube testers and soldering irons, and the accumulated knowledge of thousands of failed sets diagnosed and repaired. Gone in a generation. Replaced by the receipt from the electronics store that says your television has been declared not cost-effective to repair and suggests that you consider one of the new models on display at the front of the store. The television still breaks. Now we throw it away. Please subscribe before you go. We keep finding these lost trades and the communities they served. for as long as they are worth finding, and we believe they are worth finding for a very long time yet.